Hello, and welcome to Learning from Nature, the Biomimicry podcast with me, your host, Lily Ehrman. Thanks for tuning in today. Are you ready to level up your biomimicry knowledge? Today's episode will equip you with some new tools and perspectives on how we can apply this methodology in practice to a really important area, our food system. I am joined by my dear friend and colleague from my time at Arizona State University's Biomimicry Center, Sara El Sayed. We will do a deep dive into life's principles, a set of 26 design lessons from nature that offer guidance on how to create conditions conducive to life. And Sara will discuss how she is integrating and expanding the potential of biomimicry in regenerative food spaces. Sara has a joint position as the co-director of the Biomimicry Center and assistant research professor at the Swette Center for Sustainable Food Systems. She has a doctorate in food system sustainability, specifically on regenerative food practices in arid regions, and a master's in biomimicry, both from Arizona State University. She also has a biomimicry professional certificate from Biomimicry 3.8. She held a postdoctoral position at the School for Future Innovation and Society in public interest technology. Her research interests include exploring ways to have more regenerative and net positive local food systems, and she is currently involved in the local Arizona food space. Previously, Sara worked as a researcher in biomimicry and microbial geographies. She is the co-founder of several enterprises in Egypt. Nawaya is a social enterprise working as a catalyst to transition small-scale farmer communities into more sustainable ones through education and research. Dema is responsible for outdoor environmental education, teaching young adults about biomimicry and local Egyptian communities. Cleola is an LLC producing low-tech irrigation systems. Sara is on the board of Slow Food, an international movement that started in Italy aiming to safeguard local food cultures and traditions, and does so by promoting good, clean, and fair food for all. She's an avid traveler, nature lover, and enjoys tasting foods, cooking, and interacting with people through food experiences. Let's dive right in. Well, I'm so excited to have you with me today, Sara. I will start off by having you introduce yourself with your pronouns, please.
I'm Sara El Sayed, and I use she, her pronouns, and I am just starting a position as co-director of the Biomimicry Center at Arizona State University. I have a master's degree in biomimicry that I obtained kind of in mix of things, which is that I initially started the program with Biomimicry 3.8 and was part of what I guess was called the Biomimicry Professional Program. But then it morphed and became, we had the opportunity, some of us, the cohort, to actually get a master's from ASU. So I kind of cheated my way into that master's because I only took one course, one credit, and I graduated with a master's from ASU, which is great because that actually gave me then the opportunity to kind of get to know ASU. And now I also have a PhD in food system sustainability from ASU. So that's a little bit about my professional background. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit about my personal background, because I think these two things are also important. I am half Egyptian, half Italian. I was born and raised in Egypt. I only moved to the US 5 years ago to pursue this academic career. I have a newborn who's about is a year old, called Shams, which means the sun. And I also have three wonderful stepsons and a wonderful husband. And we all try to be connected to nature in different ways possible. So yeah, that's a bit about me.
Wonderful. And Sara and I met a few years ago when I started working at the Biomimicry Center, and I can hear your son now.
I'm so sorry.
No, I feel like that's part of this process. But yeah, we started working together and collaborated closely for many years, and then only recently, when I moved away, have I not been able to see you in so long. Yeah. So this is really nice to have this conversation.
Yes, it is nice. And, we're still collaborating on different things, so it's exciting. That's the beauty of this world. We're still new pioneers in a way, and so our network, I think, is strong, where a lot of us are well connected to each other and continue to collaborate, and I hope we continue to do so.
Yeah, yes, totally. And following up on kind of your personal and professional background, I want to know how you got excited about and interested in, and how you fell in love with biomimicry.
Yeah, so it's a funny journey actually. So I was in Cairo, Egypt, and I was working for a nonprofit that did outdoor environmental education. And I was tasked to do some research on a project we were working on. We did every year an event for World Environment Day, and the theme of that year, this was 2010, was biodiversity. And I was tasked to kind of see of what linkages are there between biodiversity and technology. And so I went down a rabbit hole on the internet and came across biomimicry. It's a similar story to many other people where you first hear about biomimicry and you're just like, oh my God, this exists. And that was exactly it. I was, so excited. As a biologist, I have a undergrad in biology. The term biomimicry was not new to me, but it was in a very different context. Biologists think of biomimicry as, organisms that try to mimic other organisms, to escape predation, for example. So that term in this kind of context of innovation inspired from nature was something that was completely new to me and super exciting. And in a way, this idea was not alien to me. I had been thinking and dabbling with this idea for forever. I think the first time I got inspired was reading Ishmael, which is kind of a book about, I don't know if you've ever read it, about chimpanzees kind of reflecting on humans and how to be mindful on this planet. But anyway, so this idea of looking at nature and learning from it was not new to me. But then, there was a term for it, and there was a group of people doing it, and there was an inspiring woman, Janine Benyus, who was giving talks about it. And so I spent, these, I think, I want to say 12 hours just doing that research, and I came across what was then called the Biomimicry Guild, and it was offering a 2-year program to teach people. And I wasn't thinking of doing a master's or pursuing any future education at all. I was very happy in my work, and I wasn't thinking about it at all. And I'm like, this is exactly what I want to do. So there and then, like literally that first time I stumbled upon biomimicry, I applied for a program. And 16 people, they choose only 4 biologists, and I'm nowhere as near good of a biologist as other people are. Our biology program at the American University in Cairo was really not that strong. And so I was like, no, there's no way I'm going to get it. And plus, I couldn't afford it anyway. So not only did I get in the program and get a scholarship, but it's just completely changed my life, because this was, a program of 2 years where part of it was online, but the other part was we would meet every 3 months at a different ecosystem. And the first ecosystem, funnily enough, happens to be the one I'm in right now, which is the Sonoran Desert. We met in Tucson, Oracle, and we completely disconnected from the world, focusing on the Sonoran Desert and learning from its natural history and so forth. And as that was happening, Egypt was just undergoing some tumultuous times. It was essentially January of 2011. I returned back to Egypt on January 25th, 2011, which was the first day of the Egyptian revolution or uprisings. And I literally got, bounced from this experience of like learning from nature to my whole country completely changing, and finding myself in a time where, well, maybe these learnings, this experience can actually be applied to seeing how this country can change. And so it's a very emotional story for me, because it's, there's a lot of sadness today related to this period, because it didn't go down like we wanted, unfortunately. But it's also one where I feel like biomimicry gave me a lot of hope, and also allowed me to create a whole bunch of different things. 2 businesses, a humongous network in Egypt, and today be here, teaching the next generation of biomimics at ASU.
Yeah, and I feel like your journey is so unique and so powerful in that aspect of being able to teach from a, background that you have, and getting so inspired by it so early on. I feel like you were really one of that first cohort of people that did that practitioner's program and did the master's. And so you have this massive biomimicry network that's just so amazing.
Yeah, it's been quite a blessing for sure. We're trying to actually build it up right now in the Middle East. So there's a group of different people across the Middle East who are trying to connect so that we can bring biomimicry into different sectors. And there's a real hunger actually for it. If we look at the numbers here at ASU of students that are joining the program, there's quite a number from the Middle East. And so there is a hunger for this. It makes kind of sense in our part of the world. Be it from a religious perspective, where we've been taught from very young to be, respecting and stewards for this land. And so there is a connection. It just, I know that a lot of us, when we first stumble about biomimicry, it's kind of like, duh, like, why aren't we doing that? And so, yeah, it's been a special journey for sure.
And what you said about hope, too, I think is really important. Like, this hopeful and humbling practice is something that I return to over and over again because it is so grounding and so comforting in that sense of like, oh, we don't actually have to reinvent any of this. We can look towards nature, and that's just incredibly comforting.
100%, yeah. I mean, I think my initial experiences of just like, really looking at nature and stuff, in this kind of way, where I used to row on the River Nile. I was a part of a crew team. And,
cool.
We'd be up in the morning at like 5 a.m. And, Cairo's a busy city. There's 20 million plus people, super bustling. And yet when we're on the river at that time of the day, all you can see is actually the natural world, the kingfishers and the gray herons and purple herons and tilapia fish, all sorts of different nature. And to me, like you're saying, it was really humbling to kind of like be like, these are incredible adapters. They're living in a super populated, polluted city, and yet they're thriving and they're doing really great, and they have all these great adaptations. So even before learning about biomimicry, I was just amazed at the resilience,
Yeah.
And so there's always so much to learn, for sure.
Totally. And recently you've been researching and applying what we call in the biomimicry world life's principles. So I'd like to dive more into that and have you explain life's principles and share why they are important.
So life's principles are, a framework that was developed really between Janine Benyus and Dana Baumeister, maybe 20 years ago, as a way of trying to frame what are these overarching concepts that we can all rally around. So it's not so much, the biomimicry that most people know of, which is like a function from a certain organism and how to emulate that. But really, what are the overarching kind of baseline principles that are part of all of nature? And so really, this is the blueprint of how to be sustainable on planet Earth. If we can emulate these principles, which are a set of 26 principles that have, over the years, kind of evolved from a set of 10, and then, they just got reframed so that they actually are more digestible and more ubiquitous and more true to the science as well. So these principles are in essentially 26 guidelines that all of the natural world follow. They exist, and every single organism follows these 26 principles. And if we were to follow all 26 of them in our designs, in our systems, then we essentially would be 100% sustainable, because they are, the most adapted ways of living on planet Earth. However, that sounds like an easy recipe, right? Let's go do that. But it isn't.
Yeah.
Some of them are easier than others, and bringing them all together is also quite a challenge. So at this point, they're quite aspirational, something like life-friendly chemistry, which is a whole segment with sub-principles of doing chemistry in water and building with a small subset of elements. All these things require us to really restructure the way we do chemistry and materials. And so that requires a whole industry to pivot and change. And that's not going to happen tomorrow or in 10 years, And so, some of them are easier to achieve than others. And some of them we're just trying to pivot the needle towards this kind of understanding so that we can also produce more research in that space, because a lot more research is also needed to try and understand what that looks like. What does nature-inspired chemistry look like? It's very different, from the chemistry that we have today in, for example, the world of polymers, where we're not doing it that way, or else we wouldn't have a problem of plastics, we wouldn't have a problem of petroleum products, we wouldn't have the problems that we have today, for sure.
And what I love about Life's Principles is it's kind of this high-level overview, like you mentioned, kind of showcasing what's possible, but at the same time making it very tactile. So you could, you have a project, you take out your Life's Principles page, and you can see like which ones you're not hitting, and then what you can do to try to move towards being more life-friendly. And I think that's where it's really impactful beyond a lot of this biomimicry talk, because so much of biomimicry you do have to like learn the process and the practice and like use those education tools and really get into it. But Life's Principles, I think, is like super tangible for a wider audience, and I think it's really impactful in that way.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it gets used, as a model, like how can I create a model that is sustainable, and therefore looking at Life's Principle, or I can think of it as a measure, as something to measure up, to audit, so to speak, a project, or audit an idea that I have. So it is tangible in that sense, that you can see how you're faring up in terms of sustainability, and really you can almost give a score if you wanted to. We prefer not to go in that direction because it's more qualitative, but you could, if you wanted to, put a score to it.
And speaking of, you recently got your PhD last year, 2 years ago?
Last year.
At this intersection of kind of food systems and sustainability, and you wrote your thesis on Life's Principles. And so I'd love for you to dive a little deeper into this connection between our food system and Life's Principles, and maybe give me a few examples of how Life's Principles could be applied to our food system.
Yeah. So really the idea came out of trying to conceptualize this relatively new term, well, now it maybe is being used more often, of regenerative systems. And specifically, I was trying to understand what a regenerative food system meant. So not regenerative agriculture, because that's a sector that's very specific, but what is a regenerative food system? So a food system being multiple components that make up our food. So not just the agricultural farming aspect or ranching aspect, but also the processing, the cooking, the disposing, all these different elements that make up the whole system of food. And the term has become, quite popularized in maybe the past few years. But I really, wanted to hear from different producers, and so I started interviewing a bunch of different producers and chefs and farmers and so forth, specifically in the southwest of the USA. I'm interested in arid regions as a geographic kind of area, given my background in Egypt, but also learning here in the Sonoran Desert. And so I wanted to see kind of where they were coming from, and interview after interview, and person after person was referring to two real buckets of where the inspiration comes from for regeneration. And one bucket was nature. Nature is providing us the answers of how we can be better in tune to be more regenerative. So not thinking just in terms of sustainability or what's the lesser evil, but actually how do I have a net positive impact in an ecosystem through agriculture, or through farming, or through production, which is often counterintuitive, because agriculture is known to be one of the highest contributors of greenhouse gases, for example, in the world globally. And so the opposite, regenerative agriculture, looks at nature to learn from how natural systems look like, and therefore mimic that to create more regenerative systems. And the other bucket that was inspiring to a lot of people as they were talking is this idea of traditional knowledge. And traditional knowledge, has many different forms. It's not one thing, but the world of academia kind of defines it, or uses the overarching term of traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, also known as indigenous knowledge or native science. There's different terms for it. And this is, it's an umbrella term, but it's not one form of knowledge. But it essentially means the knowledge systems that have been passed down through generations, through native people, through indigenous people, through their practice, through their songs, through the stories, through the dances, through the spirituality that have persisted and have essentially been most adapted. So these two worlds were the worlds that I kind of tried to weave together to see, how can I define a regenerative food system by bringing these two worlds together. And the process that I did to do that was to look at the overarching principles. So we just said right now biomimicry has life's principles, so that was an easy one. Traditional ecological knowledge doesn't have a set of principles that way, so I had to kind of scour a little bit more the literature to find what are these recurring principles that exist, and I came up with another bucket of lists, and I kind of tried to match them up. So what from the life's principles matches up with TEK principles, and I came up with 13 of those essentially. And so there's a paper out there in the world if people want to read it that kind of bridges these two things together. But just as some examples, in life's principles, we talk about things being locally attuned and responsive. An equivalent principle in TEK is the idea of place-based knowledge, that knowledge is about understanding the place, the traditions that come out of a certain place. Yes, there are some things that can be, continental or across the board, but essentially the knowledge you learn is really in place, and that experience is really important. And so that could be examples from how to there's a few indigenous scholars that talk about being a nativore, and learning from your ancestral foods, that is actually the best food for your constitution, that genetically that's the kind of best foods. And so wherever that ancestry is to you, looking back and understanding that history that you carry in your genes can help you also understand what might be the best foods for your own constitution. And so there's a movement by indigenous folks to go back to these ancestral foods, to go back here in the United States to pre-contact foods, so foods before kind of Columbus and the Europeans settled here. What were the foods that initially were here that people were eating, and how can these be reintroduced and reintegrated into a diet, and how do they affect people's constitution differently? So that's on an indigenous traditional level. But on another level, it is also what kinds of things can you be growing. So if I'm thinking of the Sonoran Desert, it's definitely not a place where I can just grow all sorts of different foods. There are very specific ecological factors here, conditions that enable certain things to grow and others not. And so again, traditional people have figured some of these things out and grown certain things in polycultures, creating a canopy so that things can grow under the shade of other things. If you look at the classic organism of the Sonoran Desert, the keystone species, saguaro, it kind of builds a whole ecosystem around it and enables so many other species to survive around it because of the ecosystem it's created. In that same way, that same principle applies in trying to create these layered canopies where you can have things growing that kind of support each other. Indigenous people talk about three sisters, for example, the corn, squash, and beans growing together in different kinds of ways. And they're, the indigenous people of Turtle Island or the United States talk about the three sisters across the whole continent, but there are differences. So for example, here in the Southwest, there's Hopi corn that is a very specific type of corn that lives it is adapted to dryland environments. It's not the same corn that you would find elsewhere, in more moist environments, for example. So that's just one example. I don't know if you want me to go into some more. I can.
I feel like it's really interesting to hear these specific examples, and also just to kind of lay the groundwork. This is so needed right now. Our food system in the US and the way that we currently do things is not working. I've actually read some recent articles about how people are projecting the food system right now to fail in the next couple of years, and to fail. I mean, it's already failing many people, but to fail on a really large scale and kind of collapse on itself. And so I think research like this is really needed, and this kind of perspective is really important too when thinking about biomimicry and how we can live in tune with place, because there are peoples that have done that for thousands of years, for so long. And so I think if you want to give a few more examples, but also just speak to kind of the importance of weaving together traditional and indigenous sciences with biomimicry and life's principles.
Yeah, so I'll give you a few more examples, and then I'll tell you why I think it's important. So another big one is cultivating cooperative relationships. That's a principle in life's principles. The idea that there are win-win relationships in the natural worlds that are symbiotic mutualisms. It's funny, people who are not as versed in understanding nature always think of nature as being very competitive. And yes, there is competition, but in reality, there's more cooperation than there's competition. There are synergistic relationships all around us, including in us as human beings, us and microbes. I find it very funny how some scientists say that, in a way, human beings are hosts with microbes rather than the opposite, because there are more microorganisms on a human body than there are human cells. So, there's a lot of synergistic and a lot of symbiotic relationships. And this same concept, the same idea exists also in TEK in terms of relationality. The idea that you relate and have a strong relationality between each other, humans and humans, but also humans and the natural world, and also humans and other parts of nature, rocks and water, the elements, for example. And so, more and more people are starting to hear, indigenous folks, as they come to a conference or present themselves, they will always introduce themselves and tell their own ancestral story. They'll tell you where they come from, what their name is. And the reason for that is because indigenous folks believe in living in relation to each other. So that becomes an important aspect of how to connect together. And so as we think of food systems, we also need to think about how we can include these different win-win relationships, this relationality, how we can live in relation to each other. And so as we're designing systems, it doesn't make sense to have a system that is devoid of pollinators, of microbes, of fungi, So, these concepts I'm giving are high-level concepts. They're not like exactly how you create a system, but that's the whole point of this. It's the purpose of this exercise that I have of bringing these two worlds together is kind of giving us these overarching ideas in relation to a food system. So if I'm thinking of designing a farm or a food project or even a city that produces food, am I excluding the pollinators? Am I excluding the microbes and the fungi? If I am, then it's not regenerative, just from the get-go. Another one is that nature leverages cyclic processes. That you have the seasons and you have the tides, and that the natural world is attuned to that. We are attuned to the fact that there are these cycles. And the same thing happens also with indigenous knowledge. There are cycles of the earth that are not just respected, but there's actually rituals that are related to it. There are fasts. There's a whole cosmology that is attached to it, because you're giving an intentionality and a respect for that. So here in the Southwest, the Tohono O'odham people will have a festival for calling the rains, and they will also give offerings to the earth in the form of after the saguaro fruit is buds and turns into a fruit, part of it is harvested and part of it is returned to the land as an offering. And it sounds like just a ceremony, but actually it's also returning nutrients. It's also, enabling the continuity of these organisms to kind of cycle. It's giving it compost in a way. So it is allowing it to flourish in a time where it is related to the cycle of rains, of the monsoonal rains, and so they can actually bud and turn into new cacti. So these kind of relationships are spiritual, yes, but they're also highly scientific. The Zuni, for example, also created these different systems of different bowls and dikes that are created to divert waters and do earthworks, so that when these rains come through, you can actually maximize on their usage. So rather than the water being flushed away or in the desert eroded away, building these different earthwork structures actually infiltrates the water and enables for the ecosystem to become more generative, essentially. A ton of other examples. Reciprocity and feedback loops is another one. One of the biggest most influential traditional ecological knowledge scholars is Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she talks about the idea of an honorable harvest. As you harvest things, you need to take permission and take only what you need, and then give thanks, and then give back a gift and create a gift economy. So just like there's a lot of these things that are, maybe when you hear them, you're like, yeah, that makes sense, but we're not actually practicing them in our food systems. Right. And so I think that transitions into why this is important. It is important because, in a way, I feel like these two knowledge systems, be it nature-inspired, biomimicry, and traditional ecological knowledge, both legitimize each other in a way. And so by weaving them together, they're giving each other more legitimacy. They're both budding kind of spaces, especially in academia. I think they're well established in practice, but in academia they're not as well established, and so in a way it legitimizes each other, and they also support each other in different ways. In a way, biomimicry gives that more scientific approach that academia kind of requires, and TEK gives the more intuitive, spiritual approach to different things. So together they can really bolster each other. In biomimicry we talk about three elements: the reconnecting with nature, and the emulating, and then there's the ethos or the philosophy and so to me I feel like TEK really represents that ethos component. It really bolsters that.
And indigenous sciences, I think, are really important to acknowledge and understand in the biomimicry world regardless. And I think this application in the food system is especially important. But even in my own biomimicry journey, I've been working really hard to do the research and the reading and understand these practices in indigenous science and traditional ecological knowledge. So my own practice can be or have more of a robust perspective. And I'm actually hoping to, interview some indigenous scholars on this podcast as well, because I feel like for a while, and biomimicry is still an emerging field, but for a while it's not been at the forefront or talked about in biomimicry. Yet there are peoples that have been learning from and translating nature's genius for a long time. So I'm excited to start to weave that in a more meaningful way.
For sure. And, you talk to a lot of indigenous folks and they talk about biomimicry. I mean, they might not use the word,
right?
But that's exactly what they're talking about. And so they're essentially, it's so woven into their understanding of the world that it just makes so much sense to learn from them. Myself and a group of other alumni from the original program started an experience that was called Biomimicry from the Soul, B-Soul. Unfortunately, it didn't continue for lack of funding, but what we had identified was we were 3 people from the Global South, so Mexico and Egypt and South Africa. And one of the things that we were feeling that was lacking was this idea that we came from lands where the indigenous traditional communities really understood the lay of the land. They really understood how to read this landscape, read the place that they're in. And so we started these experiences where we would, essentially go learn from nature, but also learn from the traditional communities, because they have the strongest knowledge, essentially, of the place.
I love that. And that actually segues really into my next point, and a question I have for you. And I mean, I think obviously, depending on where people are listening in from, doing the research and finding out what groups are nearby and what workshops are around, so you can start to learn from the people's land that you're on and their way of life and the sciences that they've had for thousands of years. But Sara, can you recommend any great books or resources on both life's principles or traditional ecological knowledge?
Yes. So definitely Robin Wall Kimmerer is a great resource. So braiding sweetgrass is definitely on the top of the list. I would also say Elizabeth Hoover writes about regenerative food systems and traditional food systems. So that's another person. She has a book that is a compilation of great stories called Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. And then actually, recently, there's a new book that came out that is not by an indigenous scholar, but is a really beautiful story of indigenous and African American communities and how they are reclaiming this regenerative space, called Healing Grounds by Liz Carlisle. So these would be the top three. There's a lot more, but these would be the top three, I would say, that were really significant recently, to me at least.
And where can people find your thesis? Because you do a great kind of intro to life's principles and TEK, and talk and write really well, I think, about that weaving of both of these practices. And I really enjoyed reading it, and I think others would too. So where can they find that?
So it's actually published. It's an article. It's called Weaving Disciplines to Conceptualize a Regenerative Food System, and it's co-authored by me, Sara El Sayed, and Scott Cloutier. And it's available online through the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development. So if you just look for Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Community Development, you should be able to find the name of the article, Weaving Disciplines to Conceptualize a Regenerative Food System.
Wonderful. Okay, Sara, last question. I ask everyone this, and I'm loving all of the different answers because it inspires me in new ways. What is one of your favorite ways to reconnect with nature?
Oh, that's so hard.
You can have a few.
Yeah, it's so hard because my favorite way is not accessible to me as much anymore, because it was back in Egypt that I did reconnect this way. And so a few years back, got excited to learn about free diving. I'd been a diver for a very long time, tanks and stuff, and go snorkeling. I just love, I love the sea, and I love coral reefs, and that whole ecosystem is just so incredible. Like seeing all these different relationships between the cleaner fish and the, all these different organisms and how they interact together. Just the corals themselves and how they are providing food and resources for all these organisms is just very inspiring for me. But when I learned how to free dive, it clicked something different in me, because you're suddenly, first of all, more vulnerable because you don't have the support of this air tank that's giving you life support. It's all on you. But it also, as you're learning to free dive, you really are learning to let go. There's a strong part of you that is about that kind of experience, that feeling. You get to do a lot of meditation before you go free diving. So you want to clear your mind and be in a peaceful place, and then you do a breathe up. You're expanding your lungs. You're really trying to connect with how to oxygenate this whole body of yours and bring in pure oxygen into your cells, and really focus on this body, this vehicle that you have. And then, you hold your breath and you let go. And you need to trust that your body can do this. You start getting shivers. Your body's telling you, I need to gasp for air, because it's telling you that there's too much CO2. But in reality, you can keep going for much longer. You just need to let that go and trust that your body can keep going. And it's interesting because it actually connects to our old mammalian brain. We, as humans, have had this ability to dive for a very long time. It was a defense mechanism that enabled us to kind of protect ourselves from land predators. When you get shocked, someone scares you or something, you gasp for air because it's a signal of you taking air before you dive in. That's your way of protecting yourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But it also enabled us to catch fish and to go deeper and survive on marine organisms and so forth. And so there's this interesting kind of dynamics in that world of becoming more in tune with the natural world and letting go that I think is fascinating. But it is a practice, and I haven't been practicing in 5 years, so I feel like I've kind of lost it for now.
Freediving
that's definitely my favorite.
Is so cool. I remember reading, there was a really good book called Deep, Freediving,
Yes.
Renegade Science, and what the ocean tells us about ourselves. And like you were perfectly describing it. And for anyone that wants to like physically feel as you're reading the book, kind of what that's like, it's a really great description. But yeah, I mean, it's like you're experiencing nature, but then also like experieing your own biology.
Your own biology, exactly.
In a totally different way. And that's, I mean, my fear receptors, I would need a lot of training to get good at that.
I mean, by the way, I'm scared like crazy. This is what I'm saying. It's a really interesting kind of self-exploration of how we are nature.
Yeah.
That's a good question that we ask ourselves. We do this exercise with students of asking, are we nature? Are we separate from it? Are we above it? Or, we ask this kind of Socratic questions. And I feel like this exercise of free diving really makes you think about that, how
Totally.
are we connected to how are we nature?
And then when you do free dive, and he talks about this in the book too, it's like experiencing the underwater world in a new way because you don't have all that equipment and the noise and the air bubbles. So yeah, I'm sure you've seen some really cool stuff down there.
Yes, yeah, the fish and stuff, they react to you very differently for sure. It's different. It's very different.
Oof, what a note to end on. Thank you so much, Sara. I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you so much. This has been exciting.
That's all, folks. I hope you are a little more inspired and excited by the potential of biomimicry and our future here on our shared Earth, especially as it relates to what we eat. Now, I will leave you with one of my favorite Janine Benyus quotes. The answers to how to live sustainably on our planet are all around us.